Stations project, which brings together young people from across Africa and Europe to share their unique local and regional lenses of the global issues we're all facing today. And the issue we're discussing today is particularly poignant. It is often said that the lockdowns around the world have generated a myriad of issues. But have they really generated them, or have they just made them more visible and unfortunately more acute? This is really the case with the domestic violence, which has affected all sexes and all genders, but in particular women, and also the elderly and the children. Women or in the peaceful countries, but especially women in the conflict-related, conflict-affected areas have issues with the economic, sexual, psychological violence. They further have issues with reporting it, and they further have the issues with receiving the needed psychological and medical help. On the one hand, there are many positive developments. There are grassroots initiatives on how to report domestic violence away from the abuser. There are the initiatives of the enhanced legislation to prevent domestic violence and protect the victims. But on the other hand, for instance, at least in the context of the Council of Europe, we have the declarations of certain states that they might leave the Istanbul Convention, the core instrument of the Council of Europe, preventing domestic violence and protecting its victims. So where are we heading? And more importantly, what solutions can the young people propose to the governments, to the policymakers, to make the real change in the poignant issues of domestic violence, especially post-COVID? We have two extraordinary speakers today who know how to bring the initiatives from the ground to the policy making and to the law. Later they will be presenting for 5 to 7 minutes each. And then we will have the 3 presentations from our younger participants who would come up with their proposals of what can be done to tackle the issues of domestic violence and further violence against women. Our first speaker today is Ms. Susan Nyabena, the project manager of mobile gender-based violence in Kenya and the founder of Gender Inc. Susan is a gender and social development activist. She's particularly fascinated about the issues of women and children's rights, and she puts the issue of gender equality at the core of all further discussion about economic, political, and social change. Susan, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kateryna. Thank you for having me. It is a pleasure. I'll just dive right into my remarks. So the 16 days of activism to end gender-based violence is here. And we are reminded of the negative effects and the disastrous consequences of unacceptable abuses meted out on defenseless women and girls who happen to be our children, our sisters, our wives, the mothers, and our aunties. And the time to act is actually now in order to prevent the violence against women and girls. And gender-based violence is actually a violation of human rights and is reflected in fundamental international and regional laws, instruments and agreements, such as Convention of Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW, the UN General Assembly Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women based on the Beijing Platform for Action, and the Protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the Rights of Women in Africa, that is popularly known as Maputo Protocol. Yet, 1 in every 3 women experience gender-based violence or violence against women in their lifetime, while 35% of these women have experienced physical and sexual violence. In this year of 16 days of activism, it is being observed under the theme of Orange the World, fund, respond, prevent, and collect. And on funding, we need to prioritize the funding for GBV prevention. on prevent, we need to have policies for GBV with concrete action plans, which is actually a very big gap that we're experiencing. On respond, we need to ensure minimum essential services are available for GBV survivors and victims. And then collect, we do need to collect data for improvement for GBV services and programs. And gender-based violence is actually a cross-cutting problem that impacts victims' lives in several ways, including their cultural, economic, social, religious, and political participation in development issues. This reinforces the need for numerous stakeholders, including government agencies, non-governmental organizations, and other institutions to advocate on issues surrounding violence and to participate in violence-fighting activities. I would say I'm deeply concerned about the persistence of sexual violence in Africa, especially against women and girls, men and boys, especially during the COVID-19 period. And emerging data shows that there has been a tremendous increase in cases of GBV during this COVID-19 period. And that is perpetrated by the lack of money and being confined at home with the perpetrator during the lockdown. And with the pressure on essential services and restricted movement, women are unable to reach for help. Most victims and survivors, actually. The restriction of movement limits the resources that are available to them. It has also been reported that the primary perpetrators during this period are close relatives, guardians, persons generally living with the victims. And the gender-based violence is not only a gross human rights violation, but it's a serious offense to the dignity as well as the physical and psychological well-being of women and girls. Unless this scourge is prevented and ended, we're going to be losing our women and girls, and we'll be losing our men and boys. And in this regard, I would say tackling gender-based violence is an essential step to ensuring an empowered society and positive development to the economy. There is need to employ preventive measures as key to ending gender-based violence. And we can do this by intensifying awareness creation and sensitization, implementing innovative measures that reach especially to the rural and the more marginalized women and girls, putting into consideration that women and girls, men and boys are not homogeneous. And most importantly, to have men and boys join in the conversation, either as perpetrators, victims, or survivors, and most importantly, as agents of change. And I will quote Wangari Maathai when she says, "I'm very conscious of the fact that you cannot do it alone. It's teamwork. When you do it alone, you run the risk that when you're no longer there, nobody else will do it." So I think this is the time to bring in everybody on board, from the grassroots up to people in the urban areas, to join into this fight, to join into the conversation. And then besides ending violence, we should also end the misogyny, paternalism, and objectification. These are actually the parents, I would say, of violence against, our mothers, daughters, sisters, our wives. And violence against women is just a symptom of a deep-seated patriarchal issues that is manifested and disregarded, and disrespect of women, control of women and misuse of women. And indeed, gender-based violence is nurtured from the smallest basic unit, that is the family. And for us to bring gender-based violence to an end, we need to go back to the basics. We need to go back to the family unit. And as we continue with the 16 Days of Activism campaign against gender-based violence, I actually call upon every person out here to join in the fight. Let us bring an end to gender-based violence and have a society that is free of violence. Let us just go back to our basics. Let us just go back to our roots. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan, for your very passionate and very human presentation. And of course, the ability to discuss these issues at home and tackling the issue through education of especially boys and men is crucial to finding a solution. Thank you very much. And now our second speaker is Ms. Jess Phillips, who is a member of the UK Parliament for Birmingham Yardley. She's a Shadow Home Office Minister for Domestic Violence and Safeguarding. Jess has been addressing the issues of domestic violence, sexual violence, human rights, large and human trafficking for many, many years. She also supported the launch of the Not the Cost campaign, combating violence against politically outspoken and active women. Jess, we're very much looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'll start by just saying how much I agree with the with all of it, but with the concluding remarks that Susan was saying, and that we cannot tackle the incidents of domestic abuse, sexual violence, or gender-based violence unless we tackle women's position in society, and that the root of the reason that women are beaten in their homes, that that rape is used as a weapon of war, all of these issues, sexual violence, domestic violence, they all stem from the need to control and have power. They are not crimes that are about sex. They are rarely even crimes that are about anger or violence. They are crimes perpetrated by people who have power and control over another people. And that can happen across races, that can happen across, you know, other people who are powerful over you in a hierarchy. But the greatest hierarchy we still have in every country in the world is that women have less power. And because women have less power, women are much more likely to fall victim to control that uses violence, aggression, and sexual violence in order to control them. And so in trying to seek solutions to specific incidences is one thing. Trying to think about what we would do in our local communities, what we would do at our council level, what we would do at a national level and a global level. First of all, the very first thing we have to do is look outside of criminal justice policy, which is where this crime usually sits within national legislation. It usually sits as within the issue of crime. And we need to look at the economic advancement of women and girls, and the political power that women and girls have. Because every single solution I have ever seen to this problem was led by a woman who had power, whether that is power within her family, power within her local community, power within her organization. The solutions to this problem are always driven by women who have been given a position of power, and only then will we see this genuinely change. And if I look at my own country, when there was a woman who was the Prime Minister, so Theresa May, she started the legislation, the first ever legislation in the United Kingdom that is called the Domestic Abuse Bill, the first ever piece of legislation specifically aimed at tackling this. And that was because she was a woman with power and she used that power to solve this problem. And so the very first thing that we can all do to eliminate violence is make pathways to power for the women in our communities. And sometimes that is about encouraging, asking people to stand, asking people to take on roles, encouraging, because women often need to be asked. For some reason, we have to be given permission to take on roles. And so we all have a role to play in saying to somebody, you know, maybe you should stand to be the local councillor, maybe you should put yourself forward for this job. And we all have a role that we can play in encouraging that. With regard to specific things that I have seen help eliminate violence against women and girls, it is always comes from grassroots civil society campaigning. So we need to make sure in countries where civil society does not have the same power and voice, we need to capacity build around the world to make sure that grassroots organizations have a route to speak up to powerful people. Because so for example, when I was on my maternity leave, when I had my first baby, I was a young mom. I live in an area of the United Kingdom that has a huge refugee population, and at the time there's a massive population from Sierra Leone and from Rwanda. So we're talking a couple of years ago now. This makes me feel old. But what we did in that community is we organised mother and baby groups for refugee communities in that area. And then we encouraged the women in those areas to tell us exactly what it was that they needed to be provided with, so that they could live free from abuse and recover from any abuses they may have suffered as a pattern of their status, having come from war-torn areas and having fled. And it is only, you know, the amount of progress that we made with this group of women just on the ground, in, you know, with 18 women who came to a mother and baby group. The amount of progress you can make at a grassroots level to then go and make demands of people who have power, it is always much more powerful when it comes from an authentic voice. But those authentic voices need to be given permission and organisation in local areas. Every single policy that I have ever seen that changed the lives of women, whether that was in the United Kingdom, we're about to make a law, for example, that means that every local council area, every local regional political decision maker has to, by law, provide accommodation services for victims of domestic abuse, whether they choose to or not. Lots of our local areas decided that they, you know, that it wasn't their priority to provide safe refuge and accommodation to women fleeing domestic abuse. And we have made a change to the law in this country that says that they have to, by law, every area has to provide that. And that law came from huge amounts of lobbying by grassroots organisations, NGOs, working together to speak up about the needs of victims of violence. Now, I saw in my local area in Birmingham, which is the second largest city in the United Kingdom, I was elected onto the council before I was a member of parliament. And when I was elected onto the council, I made it compulsory for my council to fund it. And I made it a political priority that they had to fund those sorts of policies so that there would be a support system for people when they fled. And that is only because I was a woman who had been given a position of power. And it constantly goes up through every single layer of decision making that if we don't empower the people who have the experience of this, we will never change it. I think that there is huge amounts that can be done and should be done. In every country in the world, there should be really specific legislation that lays out exactly what the country's response to gender-based violence is going to be, whether that's criminal situations, whether that's around education, whether that's around support services and the provision of support services. But without the people in the room who will make the right decisions, there will never be the political will to actually change this. So legislation on its own will never change this. It has to be legislation that is matched with the political will to fund the services that are vitally needed, because almost every politician these days all around the world would stand on a platform and say they cared. But in the words of the suffragette movement in the United Kingdom, it is deeds, not words, that we are interested in. And it takes the people who know what gender-based violence feels like to really have the will to change that.
Jess, thank you so much for that. You have raised so many issues, and to be honest, they reminded me of the late US Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who said exactly what you said, that the real change, the enduring change, it happens one step at a time, but it should come from the society. It should come from the ordinary people, and only then it ends up in the law, and only then it ends up on the agenda of the policy makers. And also, obviously mentioning that addressing domestic violence against women is a part of a much larger issue and a stimulation package, if I could say so, which we should actively work on to propose to somebody, and that noble example of engaging the refugee women who are particularly vulnerable. It just addresses so many more issues of inclusivity, of the integration, and of the more inclusive and enhancing community. So thank you very much for providing those examples. Dear friends, I'm now inviting our colleagues from the community to present their policy ideas for countering domestic violence. We've got 3 presentations which will be presented now, and upon which both Susan and Jess will provide their commentaries. So please may invite Andrea Mularoni from Italy now to take the floor.
Hello?
Hello, Andrea, we can hear you.
Oh, hello. Yeah. Well, my idea, what I spoke about, can you hear me well?
Yes, thank you. We can hear you well.
So, what had been discussed on the previous call, well, the last time we talked about that pretty much we have access to many apps, we have access to social medias, we have access to landlines, and with the access of phone, we have a different type of accesses for this for domestic violence programs. And living in urban areas, we are more prone to have direct access to these programs. But when living in rural areas, people tend to have additional challenges. For instances, they would have less transport. As people living in rural areas, they would tend to prioritize their working life instead of like going into urban areas for programs and workshops and things like that. And as well, people also tend to have a lack of access to phones, for instance. And what I've been talking with Gemma, for instance, is that we think that maybe having access to radio, it's easier for rural areas. So for instance, if there would be some kind of programs or some kind of radio that would, or advertisement that would speak up about education towards domestic violence in rural areas, they would tend to have like a more widespread idea about it, even in rural areas. So that's our idea to how to access rural areas in a different way, as they will not have the same access that we have. And also because people would tend to, well, having only English speaking programs doesn't apply for everyone. So if we would make like programs that would be in different languages, also there will be like local languages. For instance, here I am in Mali at the moment. So I would assume if we were going to different rural areas, they have different type of dialects and different type of languages. So making different type of languages also for the programs. That is our idea. I don't know if you would like to expand about it.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Susan, what would be your comments about this idea with the radio, especially for the certain areas which have many dialects, many languages?
Muted.
Could you unmute yourself, please, Susan?
Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Yeah. So I would commend Andrea. Actually, radio is a powerful tool of communication and it reaches a great number of people at once. So making use of these vernacular radio stations definitely is going to ensure that there is a greater population, are able to hear, or the message gets to a great population of the community. So maybe what I would just I would have a few questions that you may maybe expound or for clarity is what is the gap that you're actually trying to address, and is that there is no information on the issues of domestic violence, that you're actually trying to start from the scratch, or there's a little bit of information, but you're trying to create awareness, on changing the mindset, breaking down the social structures and the traditional and the cultural perspective. So maybe you can expand on that. But I would say it should be considered that, males might be in charge of these radio stations, and it might affect the programs. If you should consider the content that will be shared in the radio stations, and it should be tailor-made, to fit into the awareness creation and sensitization that you hope to achieve, and maybe you can also, in the programs, you can try to do the voice calling, like the call-in programs, so you can have you can make it more participatory. The fact that you cannot maybe go physically from door to door. So having your participants calling, engaging you, for it's like it becomes a dialogue. It's more participatory, and you would have more people on board on the same. So those are my few comments.
Thank you very much, Susan. Jess, what would be your ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Susan. I think that participatory often, I mean, obviously also content that is about gender-based violence should always be led with the voices of those with experience, so experts by experience. And the best way to have that in this instance would be to have a dialogue. It is a definite problem in rural communities, the inability, and that is, I speak from a tiny country where you're never, really more than 40 minutes away from a city where I live. But even here in the United Kingdom, the rural communities' access to support services and other more universal services, even you might have to travel a long way for your schooling rather than just having it at the end of your street. Even that is sort of like a lockdown for the people who live there. And so it is a vitally important issue to tackle in how we best reach people in rural communities and how we provide support and services. But I think that Susan is right, is that the most radical, if you will, way of reaching and supporting women in rural communities around the world is to be beaming out content about cultural norms. And breaking down cultural norms, because we can't assume that necessarily women would listen to this on their own and be entitled to a private space to sort of discover themselves in this. But messaging that is about women being empowered, women being able to work, women being economically secure in and of themselves, and that women are not owned, or they are not somebody's property, and or not just sex symbols either, that they are, fundamental beings. That would, that would be revolutionary if we had it in countries like the United Kingdom, to be perfectly honest, let alone elsewhere, because so much of the media that we experience, no matter where we are, places women either under the ownership of men or as sex objects.
Thank you very much, Jess. And I think the idea with radio is really fascinating, especially for educational purposes, and especially when knowing the cultural context of particular regions. But here, probably my experience in international criminal law also speaks that radio could also be used for spreading violence, and it's really important, like in the case of Rwanda, for instance. So it's really, really important to understand what messages are being sent there, but to also probably ensure the alternative routes for communicating the instances of violence. Because if the special telephone numbers or the addresses of the shelters are indicated through the radio, that could further endanger the victims of domestic violence, because the perpetrators would know the address of the shelter. So I think, Andrea, the radio idea is very interesting, but it should also be very tied to the issues which are being communicated to the radio, and to determining what are the safer ways to communicate the addresses of the shelters and other medical or psychological health venues. Our next speaker, our next community member is Montaha Natah from Libya. And Montaha, we're very looking forward to hearing you. You're still muted, Montaha. Could you please unmute yourself?
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello, yeah, thank you. We can.
Hi, I'm sorry, I missed the introduction that you said. Did you mention anything I should know about now?
With the general introduction, we just discussed the topic, and then Susan and Jess spoke about their experience of bringing the domestic violence issues to the policymakers' tables. And then we're now just discussing your policy proposals, how you would see your local and regional approach to addressing the domestic violence.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Montaha Natah. I'm from Libya, but I study at the American University of Beirut in Lebanon, and I'm majoring in political science and international law. So basically the points that I mentioned as ways to prevent domestic violence are all coming from my background with living in the Arab world. So for example, when it comes to providing hotlines to report domestic violence and all that, it might sound very simple, and it's actually present in many countries, available for everyone. But when it comes to the Arab world, this service is kind of missing, as if they do not really give attention to. Of course, I do not generalize in all countries, but in specific countries, this is not available. Although the domestic violence in the Arab world is significant, a lot. When it comes to psychological support, I mentioned this point because you know that many of the Arab countries have experienced wars, ongoing wars till today, yet no psychological support is provided. For example, Libya has been going in and out of wars for more than 9 years now, yet there is no single organization or any, let's say, company, clinic, anything that works on providing psychological support. Although most of the population is suffering from PTSD and other problems. Okay, when it comes to laws, this is the same thing that applies to most Arab countries, especially Egypt. The enforcement of law is absent, and perpetrators can easily get away with their violence, especially when it comes, as I said, this topic specifically is seen as a taboo, you can say. Domestic violence is really a taboo topic. Like, you can't really say if you're getting, let's say, if you're getting hurt by your parents, your brother, and any of that, you can't talk about this because they see it as if you're saying bad things about your family. You cannot do that. That's just wrong. Even if you're getting hurt, even if whatever is happening to you, you just cannot. When it comes to education, this is the same thing why the topic of domestic violence is not included in the curriculum, because it just sounds wrong to them, you know. So in many countries, NGOs are trying to change the stereotype, but I would say that I would say they are doing a good job, but of course it's not going to be 100% effective if the government does not collaborate with them or help them to reach the goal where they actually prevent domestic violence 100%. This is all I can say right now, so I'll leave the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Montaha. Jess, could I invite you to comment on the proposals, please?
I mean, that's an incredibly important point, that in lots and lots of parts of the world, this is still incredibly taboo. The only way it stops being taboo is by people speaking up and people being given the space to speak up. Education programs and being able to actually discuss these issues is, in every country in the world, fundamentally the only thing that is actually going to change it in 20 years' time, without question. But making sure, and this has been a struggle even in the United Kingdom, making sure that they are not designed with a cultural perspective over the top of them has been incredibly difficult in a largely secular country. With this, it's still very, you get a huge amount of pushback on what can and can't be spoken about, and so that is always going to be a concern. But the only way this is going to change is through such programs as have been outlined.
Thank you very much, Jess. Susan, could we hear your opinion about the proposal, please?
Okay, sorry. Yeah, Montaha, I want to say your idea is so great. I like the fact that you want to include gender-based violence in the school curriculum, which is actually a key package, under the comprehensive sexual education, and it will certainly have a positive impact as a preventive measure in ending domestic violence, And I think you've also talked about this, and I'll just maybe reiterate. My questions to you would have been, how would you overhaul the cultural and traditional aspect that fuel domestic violence, considering that Libya is majorly Arabs, and there are strong cultural, traditional, and religious, rules and regulations, and they've taken root. So how are you planning to, move around this issue or get through this issue? And how would you handle, the religious institutions that you consider there are strict rules and regulation on talking about such issues? And you've already mentioned, it's considered a taboo. It's not a conversation that people have. It's considered, it's a private sphere. It is something that happens at home, stays at home. People don't speak up, And I would say that maybe you can consider now on things that you can put into consideration. You can check if there are already existing support system for the victims and survivors. In this case, then you would want to maybe partner with them and reinforce them. That is in making sure that they meet the minimum standards to accommodate the survivors and victims. You can also partner with the traditional and religious institutions, or rather leaders, because they are key. If your biggest challenge is these traditional leaders and religious leaders, if you're not able to have them on your side, it's going to be your biggest challenge when it comes to, having to incorporate GBV as part of the school curriculum. So you can also bring in the policy makers to be able to, champion, speak out, because sometimes it's good. Like Jess has said, the more you speak out, the more it gets, it gets known and people pick it up, and then, you will start to see the change. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. And thank you very much, Montaha, for your proposal and for bringing up also the psychological support issue. I think that especially in the war-affected country, in the conflict-affected country, as you mentioned, with also larger post-traumatic stress disorders and larger psychological issues, it's very important to finally break this prejudice against the mental health support and just the discussing of these psychological issues, and starting with helping the victims of domestic violence could be the way to address the larger prejudice against these mental health issues in a society, and especially in a conflict-affected society. So in my opinion, as a lawyer and as a human being, it's a very important thing to implement. And dear friends, before we move to the third and final proposal, I kindly remind you that we're really looking forward to your questions for the Q&A session, which we're going to have in less than 10 minutes. Please do type your question in the Q&A section, and we will discuss them after our third presenter, who is Ashiru Ayuba Danomau from Nigeria. Ashiru, we are looking forward to hearing you. The floor is yours. Could you unmute yourself, please, Ashiru?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Ashiru Ayuba Danomau. I'm from Nigeria. So I thank you for this wonderful time. I propose about the lockdown of mine resulted to pandemic action, which I think
Ashiru, there seems to be
we are going to consider what happened.
There seems to be a little problem with the sound. It was just a bit slow. Could you repeat your previous point, please?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, now well, thank you.
Okay, so I propose about lockdown of mine and the result of pandemic, which I think the problem that we face in the year 2020 is about the high rate of rape, abuse of children, and also kidnapping here in Nigeria. So we have that problem, and also looking at the lockdown, there are a lot of conflict between families. Staying at home, everyone is just frustrated, because children are supposed to be in school, parents are supposed to be in their working places and businesses. So what I propose is about how we are going to help in terms of this kind of situation. So what I'm just thinking is if government should help to make things possible, if something like that happen, because Nigeria is a country whereby we have a lot of conflict, situation, violence. You can just wake up like today you are just in peaceful period of time, but tomorrow you may wake up like having coffee and the rest of them. So what I'm just thinking, if the government will help, should make things flexible, where people can be busy even as they are at home. If people are free and they don't have anything to do, we can have such violence. So I'm just thinking of if government should help to provide job for people, even while they are at home, they can do something. And also another thing I think is community. Community can help, like we are having Chatham House to talk about things that are disturbing us. How can we face them? How can we try to rectify things like in our own society based on our own culture and tradition? How can we face, what are the things that are welcome in society? What are the things that we need to reject in our society? And also what I think also family have role to play in our own society. And they have to teach their own children what is right and what is wrong in our society. So they will help. Individually, we also have something to offer, which has to do with understanding the moral or ethical conduct in our own society. What can we do to maintain our own integrity, and what can we not do so that we violence? So that's my proposal. I think government have a role to play, community and family. Individually, we have something to play.
Thank you very much, Ashiro. Susan, could you provide your comments, please?
Okay, so Ashiro, thank you so much for your proposal. And I saw your topic was on the lockdown of the mind, results of the pandemic. So I would say having alternative programs that people might indulge in is actually a brilliant idea, considering the much time people have at hand after losing their jobs. You know, it might act as a distraction, but also act as a, psychological support, so people can feel that they're actually indulging in meaningful activities. And I must say that I observed that you've not stated whether the programs that will be offered will be free or you will charge the participants. And are these new skills that are being introduced, will they help them get a job, or after they finish the training, they're able to secure a job from, your organization or the organizations that you partner with? And you've mentioned that the government should come in. I'm looking at it at the government, we've called on to the government so many times, and at times we are failed. So talking about the community that you've mentioned, what are those new ideas or new things we can come up with, implement, so we can able to build ourselves as a community from down and be empowered, as rather to depending so much on the policies and existing instruments, legal instruments, that most of the time are more of paper than less of implementation. And I would recommend that you may want to partner actually with maybe human resource firms that will help you connect your participants with potential employers. So when they're done with the training, at least they have, like you have an exit strategy for them. You also have the trainings should have a sensitization aspect on the gender-based violence, highlighting on the need of dialogue as a form of solving conflict rather than violence. So this is able to capture them, like bringing in the new training skill sets that the skill sets that you're mentioning about. But then again, not forgetting that you're trying to sensitize people on the issues of gender-based violence, specifically domestic violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. Jess, could we hear your opinions, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Susan, I would agree with everything that Susan said, that meaningful activity, which is why we saw the rise of domestic abuse and sexual violence during the lockdown, is because people were, well, actually, I need to be completely frank and say the COVID-19 hasn't caused any more gender-based violence than existed before. It's just increased the level of risk and access of abusers. People being at home doesn't make them into violent patriarchal abusers. They were that already. It just increases the risk that will happen because people have fewer escape routes, and people have more time and access to the people that they might wish to abuse. So I think that any programs, distraction programs and activities that can be put in place in order to expand people's own self-worth and enable them to not need to have control is absolutely vital. And a person that, I mean, I would say for all the people in a home, that would need to be programs laid out like this that had meaningful outcomes rather than just a distraction and a diversion to stop people raping, because I get really bored at home. I don't go and abuse my children. So, you know, boredom is not that necessarily, and it's a lack of self-worth. And so programs that would work on that, I think, are important. I would also say that, you know, you need to have some element of schemes that are put in place that overlay some of the things that we, you know, that challenge the cultural perceptions that people have around women, girls, violence, casual violence and abuse as well.
Thank you very much, Jess, and thanks a lot to all the three presenters for their brilliant ideas. And although they're nourished by their local experiences and regional experiences, it's also, I think, very insightful to see that the proposals and the issues and the proposals are truly universal. So thank you for sharing that. And dear friends, we're now moving to our Q&A session. Thank you very much for submitting your questions, and you can still do so. We have two country-specific questions, which I would address separately to Susan and Jess, and then we have two more general questions. So Susan, could you please comment on how do we educate communities and cultures who objectify women and consider them to be part of their property, male property, as I understand. The example here is Kenya.
Okay, yeah, we do actually have a lot of objectification of women in Kenya, not necessarily within the pastoralist community, but we have one community, the Luo community, they still practice wife inheritance. So if your husband dies, you're a widow, you actually get inherited by either the brother or the uncle or the cousin. They actually objectify women, you know, you're just like objects, you can pass you from one individual to another. And I would say this is all about the mindset, the socialization. So we, from what I'd said in my opening remarks, we need to go back to the roots. We are having children, you know, coming up and seeping into the cultures that are already existing. So we need to start the conversation there, you know, like the way Montana had said, we incorporate these things in the school curriculum. Let us educate them every little opportunity we have. And then again, it is very, very key to have men and boys in this conversation, because most of the time they are the perpetrators. Having them understand that actually what they are doing is not right. They might have, you know, grown up ancestors of ancestors, so they call them, have been practicing it. They never questioned. So having conversations with men and boys to make them realize that actually what you are doing has impact. So this is able to give women, you know, their independence. And then also we need to empower women economically, because, you know, lack of resources, when you're poverty, you know, when you're living in poverty, definitely you're disadvantaged, you're very vulnerable, you're dependent on the man who basically can do whatever he thinks is, you know, right, his property. And also talking about the cultural things on the bride price, you know, when we pay the bride price, it's like we own you, we've bought you, you know, from your, you know, from your family. So it's like you've become my property. I can, you know, dispose you as I wish. So having the conversation from the roots, engaging our children as young, you know, at the moment they're able to understand the basics, let us start from there. So we'll be able to change the mindset, which will have a positive impact in the long run.
Thank you very much, Susan. And perhaps we could feed in here the second question for you as well, because it's also culture related, although I think it's the universal culture. There is this prevalent argument, unfortunately, put on women that they should bear with the domestic violence because it's for the sake of preserving the family, preserving the marriage, and for the children to still have the father. How do you think we should address this argument?
I would say, I think this one just requires more of something, you know, practical, something more aggressive. There is no other way you can politely say that, you know, you should walk out of the marriage. You just need to be aggressive about it. The violence that you keep on saying, you know, I'm staying for the sake of the children, or I'm staying because the society, you know, I'm the woman, I'm supposed to make the home. At the end of the day, you are damaged, you are broken. Your children grow up believing that violence is normal. As for the ladies, when they get married, if they marry a violent partner, they will not even think that it is wrong because they saw their mother going through it. As for the men, they pick it up. They believe that, okay, as for women, I can do anything and whatever I want. So these are just conversation. We need to shame perpetrators. Like, there is no shortcut to it. We shame these people. We talk about it. We speak out. I tend to say that you can cause as much drama as you want to be able to save life, you know, to have that peace of mind, you know, emotional peace, psychological. Let us just cause drama. If you know somebody is violent, it doesn't matter, just cause the drama that you need to make the noise. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Susan. And Jess, there is a direct question to you. The lady, I suppose, is sharing her very poignant personal experience of being the victim of domestic violence and now becoming independent and stronger and moving on from that. But unfortunately, she also says that the society did think that...
Sorry, my cat is attacking.
Yeah, that a respectable man kind of couldn't do that, and that it was the pattern of her falling and hurting herself rather than being abused. And the lady also says that obviously the things have become better in the UK, as you described. But what are other things do you think the women in the UK could do to support those in need, to support the victims of domestic violence in your country?
Yeah, I mean, whilst in my country we don't have any sort of culture of inheritance of women or bride price or any of those things that you know seem to perpetuate this sort of culture, I don't want people to think for any second that there isn't the same cultural problems in the United Kingdom, where people believe that, just in answer to the previous question, that a family needs a father. Well, you know, it's still very, very, very pernicious, even in the United Kingdom. The idea that it is a woman's responsibility to not become a victim of domestic violence. These things haven't gone away at all, even though there has been huge progress over the years with regard to legislation. Culture changes much slower, and currently we're in a very, very big battle with regard to the idea of, yes, sort of respectable fathers should be able to see their children regardless of how much abuse they have perpetrated against their mothers. And I couldn't agree with Susan more that we just have to shame those perpetrators, and you have to speak in terms as certain as, if you are an abusive father, you are not a good father. The end. It is as simple as that. And that the reality is what we need to be doing much more of in the United Kingdom is we need far greater access to support services for all victims, regardless of where they are in the country, regardless of where they their age, their disability. Disabled women in the United Kingdom are considerably more likely to be abused by people who are meant to be caring for them. We need far greater access to support across the board, and what we can be doing to help women in the United Kingdom is putting ourselves out there to believe their stories. That is, as an individual, that is the most powerful thing you can do. People often say to me that it's difficult to get people to come forward if they're victims of abuse, but I have never found it difficult, because I very publicly state that I am here to listen and that I will believe you and you can talk to me. And if everybody worked to make it so that in your workplaces, in your local high streets, and where you go and drink a cup of coffee in the morning, if people made it clear by simply asking questions like, is everything all right at home? Simple things. You would be surprised how quickly people come forward. Women have told me that they've been raped the night before at a 5-year-old's birthday party, a woman I'd never met. People in the supermarket will come up and tell me that their husband is beating them up, because they know that I can hear them. And we all have a responsibility. Every single person has a responsibility to make themselves available because it is everybody's business, and we're never going to tackle it, one person at a time. We all have to take responsibility.
Thank you very much, Jess. And I hope we can have a couple of more minutes to answer 2 more questions, because they're very interesting. There's a question from Andrea, who says that, well, there are also male victims of domestic violence, and they often do not come forward because they would think that they wouldn't be believed to, and they usually don't take part in the policy making concerning domestic violence. Do you think, Jess, this is an issue, the domestic violence against men, and how do we engage them in these conversations?
Yeah, I think it is an issue. I think that if we don't see domestic abuse specifically, rather than other gender-based violence, through the prism of gender-based violence, that it is rooted in gender, we will do a disservice. And so I make sort of no apology for framing it in those terms, but there are absolutely men who are abused in their homes, whether that is by female perpetrators or in fact male perpetrators, certainly those in same-sex relationships, and as well, and they have to be part of policy making. In the United Kingdom, they are absolutely part of the policy making platform, and they are, as are perpetrators of domestic abuse and the organisations that work with perpetrators of domestic abuse. And that is, of course, right, because we shouldn't leave solving this problem to victims of violence. It is perpetrators who ultimately will have the greatest responsibility in changing this as we go forward. But in the United Kingdom, they certainly are. Men are part of the conversation. What you have to be wary of and careful of in these circumstances is ensuring that there is space for all victims to speak, and making sure that when you have policy making decisions, you make it so that everybody can speak. And that sometimes means making adjustments. So having women's only meetings, for example, is an adjustment that helps women come forward with their ideas, experiences and desires for the future. Similarly, having specific and targeted policy making initiatives that target male victims and ask them what they need. Similarly, doing it all together wouldn't necessarily work. It might do in some cases, but you've got to target it to make sure that you're not missing anyone.
Thank you very much, Jess. And I have the parallel example from the international criminal law and conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence. And there is a growing amount of evidence saying that men find it increasingly hard to report sexual violence. They would report torture, but not the sexualized aspects of torture. And there has been a research into the Rohingya crisis and the persecution and violence there, where men would also say that they would find it hard to come up and confess those issues. It primarily because men are usually considered to be perpetrators. Similar issues arose also in the Yugoslav conflict. So unfortunately, it is the issue both domestically and in a larger war-related context. And I totally agree that the debate should be inclusive. It's about protecting the victims, whoever they may be. Susan, could you please take the final question about using the social media as a tool for spreading the information about domestic violence and about the means to prevent it? What would be the most innovative approaches to use social media for this purpose?
Okay, so I would say right now it's more of an in thing, so it is actually a good opportunity. All you just need to do is tailor make what the content of your conversation or whatever you want to talk about to your specific audience, because using an example of domestic violence, it is vast. It's really vast depending with your location or where you're doing the implementation of the project. So these are things you need to put in mind. So you tailor make your information to be able to, grab the attention of your audience, reach out to different organizations. And then also you don't have to do it on your own. If you have already maybe organizations that are doing the same campaign, it is something you can join in, because when you join in, it has a bigger impact rather than, having small doing the same thing, so it looks scattered. So these are some things you can reach out to organizations that are already doing if you're doing the same thing, and they can be able to help out. But then again, social media is more, it will restrict you a little bit, or rather it will be reaching out to more of the elite and the people living in the urban areas with good internet access, electricity. So when you look at the rural people, that is where now she can employ in the radio aspect, distribution of pamphlets. This is all part of media, though not social media, but you can also use, employ the print media, the news media, and you're able to reach out to, those people. You can also have survivors and victims come in. People tend to relate, with somebody who has gone through it, rather than somebody who's just giving a story, or, like trying to imagine what they go through. So if you could have, a champion, a survivor or a victim who would want to, support the conversation to come forward, it's really good, because it makes people feel comfortable and start to open up, and they realize that we are actually not by ourselves. Because most victims and survivors tend to think that, they're in their own world. It's like they're rejected. It's like they're no part of our society. So if you have, somebody who relates, somebody who has been through what they've been through, it tends to have a greater impact.
Thank you very much, Susan, and thank you to everyone, dear colleagues, for joining us today, submitting your questions, submitting your comments, and dedicating your evening really to discussing the very poignant thing which has to be discussed. And we have already mentioned today the late US Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and she said that despite all these data about domestic violence, about sexual violence, and still prevalent discrimination of women, she is quite optimistic about the direction to where we're going. And she was the lady who came from the period when women could not open bank accounts in their name, or when the rape in marriage was not considered to be a crime. Ruth said that for us, for our generation, the major challenges to address would be the unconscious bias and also sexual harassment at work, and also domestic violence. But as she said, the fact that increasingly more young people care about these things and engage in proposing policy changes is the right way to really dealing with these issues. So I wish you all the inspiration in this, and we really can make change all together at the places where we are professional at. Stay healthy, stay positive, and thank you for joining us. This video will soon be available on Chatham House's website. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.